Hello and welcome to Pro Revolution Soccer. We are filming this particular episode of the podcast because we want its contents to be shared as far and as widely as they possibly can be, because it's a vital conversation about football and Palestine. I'm going to begin by very briefly outlining my own position on the situation in Gaza. Israel, the most powerful country in the Middle East, backed by the United States of America, acts with near total impunity on another people. There is no symmetry in this relationship, and it is a classic case, a classic dynamic of oppressor and oppressed. It seems that Palestine has been abandoned by world leaders to destruction and genocide at the hands of Israel. The official death toll since October the 7th sits at 55,000 and counting, but Lancet have recently reported that the death toll, the real death toll, is likely to be as much as 40% higher. The death toll since the Nakba, the mass displacement and dispossession of Palestinians during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, is probably inestimable at this point. It should be impossible to justify any of this. As such, we as a podcast, I as a person, express total solidarity with the people of Palestine, including their right to resist. There, that didn't seem so hard, did it? But we haven't heard much of that sort of sentiment on any of your traditional legacy media platforms, or from anybody who's anybody, particularly in the world of football, apart from one or two exceptions. Today, we're here to discuss why that might be and what potentially we might be able to do about it, with two very special guests. Tasnima Uddin is the Advocacy Officer at the European Legal Support Centre, an independent organisation providing legal defence and support for the Palestine solidarity movement across Europe. She's led campaigns defending workers, academics, students and encampments targeted for their solidarity with Palestine, including the campaign to reinstate Mark Bonnick following his dismissal from Arsenal Football Club. Franck Magennis is a barrister originally from the north of Ireland, now practising from London at the Bar of England and Wales. He has particular expertise and experience representing Palestinian and anti-Zionist clients across a range of legal areas, including asylum, employment and regulatory law. Welcome both to the podcast. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
We said that we'd sort of discuss just football generally and your relationships with football to start off with. Frank, you've got a kind of a boilerplate explanation of your relationship to football.
I suppose it depends who I'm talking to, but I mean, I grew up in the north of Ireland, and people in Ireland are obsessed mostly with Gaelic football and hurling. So I played Gaelic football when I was a kid. Some of my fondest and earliest sporting memories are involving my county, Armagh. Armagh won the All-Ireland final for the first time in history in 2002 when I was a kid. So I do love Gaelic football. That's my first sporting love. But back in the day, everyone in the north of Ireland supported Manchester, so I sort of duly followed suit. And then as an adult, since moving to England, becoming a Londoner effectively, I've sort of struggled to pick a team, but I am very open to the possibility of doing that. I just need maybe a bit of a nudge of, like, someone needs to explain to me, like, it's not that deep. You basically just have to pick a team, start going to games, and then it creeps up on you. And then one day you wake up and you're screaming when they win and crying when they lose. I don't know.
That is pretty much what happens, yeah. What about you, Tasnima?
I've supported Man United since I was a kid. Unfortunately now, my relationship with football, I've actually always loved football. I used to play it with my brothers and cousins, like, every day. I was very much Bend It Like Beckham was like the film that I was like, that's me.
Tasnima, can you sort of begin by explaining to us how this kind of manifests through football and through football culture?
Football is and has been a mirror to the political and social conditions that the Palestinians have been going through since the British Mandate of Palestine and since before. And if we look back at the history of football, specifically in Palestine, and if we actually focus on, for example, FIFA and UEFA's relationship with football and how Israel and Zionists have actually used football as a weapon to further their violence, and actually they've used it to create and further their mission of nationhood, by also at the same time completely destroying any chance of Palestinians to play football. And we can look back at, like, very early, if we actually look at the Israel Football Association, and actually a lot of Zionists, their main argument actually is that Palestine never existed and there's no P in the Arabic in the Arabic alphabet, so Palestine doesn't exist. But the Israeli Football Association used to be called the Palestine Football Association, and they used to have a P crescent sewed into their football shirt when they used to play, because the Palestine Football Association started before the creation of Israel, and it was mainly made up of British colonialists and Jewish settlers at that time, and they would call themselves the Palestine Football Association. And then only after the creation of Israel, they changed their name quite swiftly to the Israeli Football Association, and FIFA let them. At the same time, FIFA, I think, took around 70 years to recognise the General Palestinian National Association that was actually filled with Palestinians that they created. So there's been a lot of, systematic suppression of football, of footballers, of sport in general. And we can see the ways, even today, how Zionists are still using football to further their agenda.
And how is Palestine advocacy typically treated by clubs and governing bodies and institutions?
If we look back to October, so after October the 7th, the Premier League advised English clubs at their own discretion, but they advised them to ban Israel and Palestine flags at their stadiums. And also just by doing that, they obviously was feigning neutrality when really they were, putting together the oppressed and the oppressor, the people that are getting bombed with the people that are bombing. You don't see that with Ukraine flags. Actually, most English clubs put out statements of support of Ukraine. Ukraine as a national team as well was considered, I think they let them go through some games as well and let them play when Russia went into Ukraine. I think it took a matter of days as well for FIFA to ban Russia and suspend them. Compare that to the last 20 months of what we've seen Israel do, specifically in Gaza, completely decimate football stadiums, sports in general. Very early on, I remember I remember seeing video of them using football stadiums to commit war crimes, to line up Palestinian men, women, children, strip them, make them dig their own graves. We can also, I remember back in, I think, 2021, where there were 4 kids playing football on a beach and then Israel bombed them. So you see all of the kind of war crimes that has been going on quite live, and the absolute silence, and not just silence, actually, just complicity in the genocide. FIFA are complicit in this genocide. And then actually, if you look back at it, FIFA have been complicit in furthering Zionism. You kind of understand now then when you see English clubs specifically suppress and censor any sort of solidarity with Palestine at all. Obviously, Arsenal fired Mark Bonnick, but you have Dagenham FC who fired Salma Mashhur. You have Hamza Chowdhury who tweeted from the river to the sea, get I think disciplined by Leicester. All these small moments you're seeing where complete solidarity is completely crushed when they know how powerful it would be if and when football fans decide to stand up against what we've been seeing, and against specifically them, the Zionists using football to justify their existence.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that there's also something slightly tricky going on here, though, isn't there? Because there's different leagues in different countries, and there's also this distinction between the sort of the mainstream leagues, the Premier League, and so on, and then kind of non-league football. And just a few things to add into the mix, I suppose. A very good friend of mine, who I think you know as well, Taz, we went to Dublin to watch Dublin Bohemians, the women's team, playing against the Palestinian national women's team. So that's quite a hopeful example of obviously soccer is less big in Ireland than it is in England, because, as I say, we prefer Gaelic football. But that's still an example of how it is possible to do really important solidarity work. And they were playing Fontaine's DC songs and stuff, and there were these amazing speakers at the start of that friendly. And then I would also say that in the non-league space, in a country like England, there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening. Obviously, you've got, I'm a Londoner now, as I said, and Clapton have been brilliant about organising solidarity football tournaments. So I'm not here to let the Premier League teams off the hook. They've been atrocious, but I do think it's worth mentioning the more hopeful stories as well. It's like it is possible to organise, and perhaps we'll come to it. But the Green Brigades in Glasgow, right, Celtic, they seem to me to be, in British mainstream football at least, to be the high watermark of what it's possible to do if you properly organise within your club to show solidarity, even though those guys often face consequences for what they do. We've all seen them, these amazing videos and photographs of their stadium in Glasgow, just awash with Palestine flags, amazing tifos, amazing banners expressing solidarity with Palestinians. So I think, as always, it's a mixed picture. And I think the ability of mainstream clubs like Arsenal, Premier League clubs, to suppress their fans' support for Palestinians is eroding. And it's for us to try to think through together, what does it mean for us to organise fans so that we can claim space within our own clubs?
I would say also there's also just there's a big gap between football associations and the fans. I think fans have overwhelmingly been in solidarity with Palestine. I think that's a global thing, and I think English football fans, especially, we can look easily at as close as PSG ultras walking around a German town, and 5,000 of them just shouting, "We are Gaza, Gaza is us." Through Germany, one of the most repressive states and most supportive of Zionism. It's just like a blatant, like really easy example of how much power and how easy it is as well, I think, to organise football fans in support of Palestine. And, if your team is suppressing your support of Palestine, there are so many ways to challenge, and we need to challenge, actually, because, this is our space, not theirs.
So we sort of talked about clubs actively censoring support of Palestine or expressions of solidarity with Palestine. Is the complicity of football's institutions in the silencing of pro-Palestinian voices something that's orchestrated by governments or states, or does it come from capital? Does it come from fractions of capital via sponsorship and the potential withholding of broadcast or advertising revenues? Or is it a combination of all the above?
I think it's a combination of all the above. I think we can't look at the support of Western states without looking at them supporting capitalism. I think Western states' main agenda for most of everything that they do is ensuring capitalism survives. So we can't really separate that. But I do think that effectively what is happening is English clubs are doing the bidding for the UK government by furthering their own views and their own foreign policy towards Israel and Palestine.
The two things I would say, firstly, Gramsci talks about common sense as part of hegemony, right? And in my experience of operating in different parts of this discussion, right, broadly the discussion about the Palestinian struggle against Zionism and the so-called State of Israel, I would say that part of what's happening here is that the management of these clubs have this kind of common sense understanding that there's certain things you're just not supposed to say. And that common sense starts to really break down when you have these, what we would say in the context of the Equality Act, we talk about comparators. In these cases, these anti-Zionist cases involving people like Mark Bonnick, you almost always have a comparator in the form of Black Lives Matter or Ukraine or whatever it is. And then you can just present to the clubs like, look, when Russia invaded Ukraine, you reacted in a certain way. But when Israel spends the better part of a century ethnically cleansing and now committing a genocide against people, you can't seem to react in the same way. And it's like they can't understand. And I think part of it is a sincere kind of, they're just hegemonized and they're just like, well, everyone knows you can't say that about Israel, even though we just said it about Russia. You can't do that to Israel, even though we just did it to Russia. So that's one thing, is that there is genuinely, I think, some hegemony going on there. And it's, as I've said, I think that hegemonic position is actually changing. I think that a moment has been reached where Zionism is so vulnerable to attack that it's no longer capable of relying on that kind of hegemonic position. I think that anti-Zionism is becoming counter-hegemonic. And the second thing I'd say is that they are businesses, and that's part of our criticism of the Premier League, right? Is that, and you wrote a brilliant article about this, right? About the way that capitalism penetrates football and vice versa. And I think with Mesut Ozil, there was this stuff to do with him talking about Uyghurs, and I do think that on some level it is just a very grubby business calculation where they say, look, whatever, such and such footballer has said a political thing about, in that case, it was Uyghur Muslims in China. We're worried that that's going to inhibit our ability to sell kits to Chinese people. And I think there was some discussion of the Chinese government stopping the games from being shown and stuff. So they're viewing it in business terms. And that's not necessarily the answer to the problem of how do we organize around this. But I think it's part of the picture. We have to understand, actually, we can make it painful for them from the other side. We have to make it clear to them, look, you're going to lose out, not just politically and in the papers, but there's going to be a financial impact if you keep suppressing your supporters as they seek to express, not just your supporters, but your players and your staff. When they try to express solidarity with people who are facing a genocide, it's going to be more of a financial problem for you to suppress the anti-Zionists than it is to defer to the Zionists. I think that's an important part of the picture.
So Frank mentioned the term hegemony there, just for the uninitiated amongst our sort of viewers for this episode, generally listeners. It just means leadership. It's just from an Italian thinker and writer, Antonio Gramsci. It's a concept that he came up with. It literally just means leadership. And a big part of what's happening at the moment is that equivocation and both sidesing around Zionism are normalised, while unequivocal statements of support aren't considered really within the pale of what's acceptable. This isn't immutable, though, is it? Hopefully, and it hasn't always been this way, has it? Tasnima, when we spoke before the episode, you had some examples of support for Palestine in football.
I mean, when I think about support in Palestine, I always think about first Maradona claiming that his heart is Palestinian, and then you also have Eric Cantona being really, really vocal about Palestine. There's also loads of examples where Eric Cantona actually helped. I think a couple of decades ago, when Israel was detaining Palestinian footballers, Eric Cantona was helping with campaigns to release them. But away from individuals, if we just look at clubs as well, Seville, I think it was 2018 or before, they actually were one of the first European clubs to go and visit Palestine, and they went to Ramallah, I think, and they went to the West Bank, and they created kind of like a relationship with Palestinian football clubs in the West Bank, and then I look at football fans and how big the Red Card for Israel campaign has become. I think more than 20 countries around the world have football fans have showed support for the Red Card for Israel campaign. From Turkey to even Germany to Morocco, especially when you see the countries that you can tell that Palestine solidarity in football is not suppressed. You have all the ultras, singing about Gaza and protesting about Gaza. So that there's been there's a long history, I think, of solidarity with Palestine with football, and specifically when I talk to my friends from Gaza, they describe football as resistance to them. They describe football as the sense of relief for them, and I think all football fans can relate to the fact that under bombardment we see kids still playing football. And, a lot of us who love football, all we need is a ball and we'll be playing football even under those conditions. And I think that's why it's such a central space of struggle, because football is a unifier. I will always see it as a unifier. It is the game that you don't need to talk. You don't need to know the other person. You just need a football, really. I think that's why it's so central, and it is a central part of Palestinians' space to express themselves, and has always been also a space to express their nationhood specifically as well. And sports does that as well.
You mentioned earlier about FIFA recognising Palestine, and a lot of people listening to this and a lot of football fans I meet just out and about who are sort of starting out on their political journeys and sometimes still working through how their politics intersects with their football fandom, or how it should intersect. They asked me why Israel, despite being a country in the Middle East, is part of UEFA, and Israel competes in European international competitions. Israeli clubs compete in European club competitions. Can you shed any light on that for our viewers in this case and listeners?
So I think it's one of the prime examples that you can look to see that Israel is a European colony. But there was actually, Israel did used to compete in the Asian Cup games, but there was a movement and there was a boycott by clubs in the Asia World Cup to effectively ban Israel, specifically when Israel invaded Lebanon. And I think Kuwait were the team who led the call to boycott Israel, because I think Israel have only won one Asia World Cup, and that's only because 11 teams boycotted the World Cup, and like they only had to play like 3 games or something like that. And then Kuwait led the call, and they were effectively banned from the Asia World Cup because teams didn't want to play with them, obviously. And then what happened is, I think they were in like a limbo for like 20 years before UEFA and FIFA invited them to play with them. And I think throughout those 20 years, they were effectively going really hard diplomatically, politically, socially to kind of create those conditions and create those relationships with top football associations. They saw it as almost like integral and important for them to continue those relationships and create them. And yeah, so 20 years later, what happened is UEFA and FIFA invited them to play Champions League with them, and not Champions
European
League.
Championship.
Yeah, teams in the global south don't want to play with them for obvious reasons. So yeah, that's why they now play in.
So it's almost like a case of Israel having this pariah status via football before almost anything else.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I think that's quite a hopeful example of where a boycott actually really does work. It's just that because they've been successfully boycotted in the Asian game, they've sort of had to retreat into the European game, and it sort of means that the struggle shifts to trying to show them the red card in the European game.
So we've come at this largely thus far through the lens of advocacy, but there are other ways, aren't there, in which football has become a terrain of struggle for Palestinians?
Yeah. So again, we just need to look back at the history of the Israeli Football Association to really understand how Zionists have co-opted the game from Palestinians, even using their own name to play under first. And it was really quite sinister because when they were called the Palestine Football Association, they had majority Jewish settlers and British colonialists, and Arabs, Palestinians at that time were not invited to play with them, even when they would call on FIFA to help them with that, which just meant they had to create their own teams and their own leagues. I mean, you see also in the West Bank, football is used as a tool by Zionists to surveil Palestinians. They shin bet the Israel security. They infiltrate the teams. They look for people that they can basically blackmail in those ways. It's really heavily surveilled. It's really heavily securitized. It's, it's quite sad because they can't, you're playing football. They're still playing football, but under, complete absurd restrictions. And then you just look at the death toll of Palestinian footballers as well. Athletes have been targeted. They don't allow, diaspora Palestinians to come back. They detain Palestinians, footballers. They target them. It's like they completely destroy all the conditions able to play the game. And then obviously see what's been happening over the last 20 months in Gaza, and there's no infrastructure, left for anything.
So are there ways in which fans resist this silencing of Palestinian voices and the, erasure and mystification of Palestinian struggle? You talked about the Green Brigades in Celtic. Are there kind of other examples of that? Or I suppose what I'm asking is, how can we actually organise fans so that they have space or spaces to express their politics and in the stadia and beyond the stadia?
I think the first thing is to challenge the censorship that is going on, especially in English football clubs. And just an example is, if we look at the Green Brigade, I think a lot of fans and people would assume that Celtic are very much in favour and supportive of the Green Brigades, and this is how they allow them to be supportive, when it's completely the opposite. They are heavily censored, heavily repressed. I think there was a point a few months ago where the police stopped, or Green Brigades didn't let them pass until they gave all their information. Like, Celtic is heavily involved in that suppression, but the difference is that the Green Brigades are so well organised and the fans are very well organised, and they've been doing this for decades. And there's so many of them. It's not just one person with one Palestine flag in one club. Obviously, that one person is going to get targeted. But if there's, thousands of fans, and there's always thousands of fans in football clubs, if there's thousands of fans actually with the Palestine flag and refusing their conditions, then that's when you're able to stand up to the suppression. And it's also something integral that fans actually have to do, because this is their club, and it doesn't really make sense that, for example, if I go to Old Trafford, I'm not allowed to, wear a kufaya or have a Palestine flag, even though I'm paying here to be here. The football is nothing without its fans, especially the clubs. And I think this is a really big opportunity and space for fans to come together to organise against these repressive tactics, because, again, like Frank said, like, Zionism is collapsing, and there is so much support for Palestine. It's the time to do it, basically. And it's also, for a football fan, you should be doing it and questioning it in general, because, again, this is your club. This is not, why should an apartheid state committing genocide be influencing your club in England's decisions towards its fans?
Yeah, even if it's only because you don't want your club to be sort of on the wrong side of history. I mean, this links back to something that we quite often discuss in this podcast, which is that, football clubs exist in kind of multitudinous ways. On the one hand, they are businesses and organisations that employ people and have, money in and money out, in much the same way that any other business kind of exists. And in other ways, they are this big, culturally really complex and important store of collective memory, and God knows how much other stuff bound up with it. And I think that's probably a really important thing to take from this, and take, it's not, our club is not just the people running that club at any given time. It's much, much bigger than that.
Yeah, and I think it's quite tricky, but also quite an exciting, almost organising problem. Like, obviously people on the left are very familiar with this idea of trying to organise a workplace, and I think we learn a lot from workplace organising, because on one view it is a workplace, because you like my client Mark Bonnick, you have workers, you have the players themselves who are a kind of worker, albeit some of them are extremely well paid, but then you also have the fans who don't relate to the club as workers, they relate as consumers. And I think we can learn stuff from looking at other organising projects. Like rent strikes is another example of a person who relates to the person who's harming them, their landlord, in something other than a worker-employer relationship.
It's also, from a Marxist perspective, a secondary form of exploitation, in the same way that being a football fan is.
Well, exactly, but also it's this. There's debates about that, right? There's
Sure.
like Engels on housing question and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, what do you do in those kind of circumstances where you're relating to the oppressive force in a different way? And I think the most successful workplace organizing strategies and other political campaigns tend to have quite clearly defined strategies, right? And so I would encourage people thinking about organizing their clubs to think in terms of concrete goals, right? What do we actually want here? What does a victory look like? Is it that we should be allowed to wear keffiyehs and wave Palestine flags at our own games? Is it that, we should be putting out a statement like what we did with BLM or what we did with the Russian invasion of Ukraine? So thinking about what the goals are, and then also thinking about, what do we need that we don't currently have to get to those goals? Like doing this quite thoughtful analysis of look, we have a lot of stuff already. There's a lot of things that we have. We have a lot of members who are angry about this. We have a lot of media attention, especially with the bigger clubs. Like as soon as you do anything around these kinds of issues, it's going to hit the media. So you have a degree of access to the media, and then bridging that gap between what you have and what you want. This piece of okay, well, what's missing? What do we need to do? And I think, as you say, with the Green Brigades, I think that we need to understand the extent to which these things were fought for. People who have control of their clubs will have that control only and to the extent that they've fought for it, and it's entirely possible for us to fight for it. It's just that we're currently, was it Malcolm X used to say, we're not outnumbered, we're out-organized, right? I'm struck by the existence of this group, Jewish Gooners, I think it's called, and I've not followed them particularly closely, but it seems as though they mostly exist to express support for the apartheid state of Israel. And it's if our Zionist opponents are organizing around this issue, it shows that there's nothing to stop us from doing it. It's just we need to put in the work to try to persuade people that it's possible to win. You just have to have a proper strategy for what it means to organise people with a view to actually winning these battles.
Frank, you mentioned Mark Bonnick's case there. What's going on with that? What's likely to happen with it, and how can people support Mark?
So Mark Bonnick was a kit man at Arsenal Football Club, and he worked there for more than 2 decades. He was a loyal, not just a fan, but also a worker at the club. He had a Twitter account in his own name that he used to comment on politics. And that account didn't link him to the club in any way. He didn't have an Arsenal shirt on in his profile picture or anything, and he didn't mention where he worked. And then it was this typical story that we see all too much in this country, but certainly in the wake of October 7th, 2023. He used that account to talk about politics. He talked about lots of things. He talked about, Brexit and, crime and all the rest of it. He had his political opinions. And one of the things he wanted to talk about, like so many people, was the genocide that we're all witnessing. So he took to Twitter to talk about that genocide. He did it in very robust terms. But as someone who's been navigating this space for a long time, sometimes I look at my client's tweets. He's not the first person I've represented who's got into trouble for tweeting stuff about Israel. And I looked at his tweets and I just thought there's absolutely nothing wrong with this stuff. It's very robust criticism of Israeli apartheid, right? He talks about Jewish supremacy. And I think a lot of people will wince at some of the criticism he was leveling at Israel. But when you think about it, he was just absolutely correct. So he's a solid working class lad with his head screwed on right. And he knows an apartheid state when he sees one. And he knows a genocide when he sees one. So he took to Twitter to just express his opinion. He got into a few scraps, as you do on Twitter. It's basically what the platform is for. So it lends itself to an argument, doesn't it? And then some quite powerful Zionist accounts, one called Never Again 2020 or something, found his Twitter account, doxed him, so found out where he worked, and then turned it into a massive story. And then before he knew it, he was in the national press being smeared as an anti-Semite. And then the club got hold of the story, and they engaged in a sort of rushed disciplinary process. They basically shoved him out the door. They conceded that he'd not said anything anti-Semitic, but they tried to suggest that he'd somehow brought the club into disrepute by having the correct position on Palestine. And on Christmas Eve last year, dismissed him, and he is now suing them. And the obvious thing to say about it is that it's an unfair dismissal claim, right? They dismissed him unfairly. It was clearly unfair, and he should get his job back. And that's the main thing he's asking for. But what we're also saying, without getting into the legal weeds too much, there's a very important case that some of your listeners and viewers will have heard of, the case of David Miller against the University of Bristol. And what that case showed was that some beliefs are so core to a person's identity that you can't really discriminate against them because of manifestations of those beliefs. And religious belief is a very obvious example of that, right? If you're sort of making people work on a Saturday and they're Jewish, it's like, well, look, I really cannot work on a Saturday. It's a religious belief. And there's an idea that certain non-religious beliefs can also be so core to your identity that to be discriminated against on the basis of manifestations of those beliefs becomes unlawful. And what Miller's case showed was that anti-Zionist beliefs are capable of that protection under the Equality Act. And so what we're saying in Mark's case is that he was an anti-Zionist. He took to Twitter to manifest those beliefs. But more than that, and importantly, by criticizing the apartheid state of Israel and its animating ideology of Zionism, he was thereby associating himself with Palestinians. And so one of the novel legal arguments that we're trying to run in this case is that he experienced associative race discrimination. He associated himself with Palestinians by standing in solidarity with them and expressing outrage at what Israel is doing. And because of that, he was dismissed. Now, in terms of how people can support, there's a petition. So people can sign a petition, but more than that, people can contact management themselves, send an email, obviously keep it polite, but say, give him his job back. It's good to criticize an apartheid regime while it commits a genocide, actually. People certainly shouldn't be fired for doing it. You're on the wrong side of this. Give him his job back. There's also a crowdfund campaign so that we can make sure we're going up against a massive football club. So we need to, if nothing else, it's a show of strength to say our legal team is also resourced and we're going to fight this all the way. And more than that, I think if you are a gooner, if you're a supporter of the club, find ways to speak to other supporters, get involved in supporters club organizations, and show up to the games and stuff. Try to find ways to actually escalate. Think about what it would mean for you to not just support Mark Bonnick, but ask yourself, why is your club so silent on this when Arsenal was putting out statements about BLM and Ukraine, as is entirely proper. Why has your club not put out a statement about the genocide that Palestinians are facing, the way that that's obliterating Palestinians' ability to play the beautiful game? Like, just think about the kind of club you want to have and think about practical ways that you can show support. And hopefully we can use this as a way of the kind of organising drive we were talking about, right? What does it mean to organise Arsenal Football Club? Well, we have this case that can help to serve as a microcosm, as a small example of a bigger problem, which is that Arsenal seems to be systematically suppressing anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian fans. And it seems like Mark's case is a way to push back against that. And I suppose final thing I'll say about his case and how it's likely to unfold, that's all up in the air. Sometimes a big club will realise, you know what, we've messed this up, and they'll roll back on their decision. So if Arsenal comes under enough pressure, there's every reason to believe that this could be settled relatively amicably. If they just admit that they made a mistake, pay my client some damages and say, here's your job back, then we can all go home, so to speak. But if they don't, then we'll take them to trial and they'll have me cross-examining them, pointing out, like, what's this now? Black lives matter, but Palestinian lives don't matter. Is that right? And yeah, I mean, in my opinion, it's an extremely open and shut case. Like, he's right to criticise Israel. He shouldn't have been fired. Give him his job back, and we won't have to take this to trial. But if they don't give him his job back, then that's exactly where we're going, to a trial in the employment tribunal, where it seems likely that Arsenal is going to come under an awful lot of criticism, and it's going to be extremely bad for their business and for their brand, because everyone's going to see them for what they are currently, which is a club that doesn't tolerate people expressing their legitimate criticisms of the apartheid state of Israel and its disgraceful actions.
They said he committed a gross error of judgment, I think was the term they used, which I thought was a particularly mad way of putting it in the context. It seemed like quite good judgment from my perspective.
Well, these phrases have a funny way of coming back to bite you, because I think in the hustle and bustle of the media and social media, people can say mad stuff and get away with it, but in a courtroom, there's nowhere to hide. Like, you're strapped in a witness box for 2, 3, 4 hours with me sometimes, and you can't hide. You have to answer my questions, right? So they're going to have to answer to this obvious disparity in treatment. And when they start talking about judgment calls, I'll just flip that around on them and say, "Oh, you want to talk about judgment, do you? Do you think it was you misjudged this one a bit, did you?"
Did the Anwar Al-Ghazi case go to trial? Did that make it that far? Or was that was settled out of court? I think he's ended up at Cardiff City now, which is a Swansea City sympathiser I'm slightly less sympathetic to, but work past that for the time being. That was settled out of court, was it? Okay. Have there been similar incidents or cases that have piqued the interest of either of you that you might want to talk about here?
Well, I think a lot of my practice is this now, certainly since October 7th. I was doing Palestine work before October 7th, but now almost all of my cases are to do with this. And I would say that there's a crisis of Zionism, which we've kind of touched on, right? I think the Israeli state and its animating ideology of Zionism is incapable of defending itself. And there's all of these morbid symptoms of that crisis. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, will be arrested if he comes to this country, like the country of one of his closest allies. The ICJ is weighing up whether or not it's genocide and has already confirmed that it's definitely apartheid, which is legally defined as racial domination. Like, all the dominoes are falling, right? Seems likely that a lot of people that's dual nationals that serve in the Israeli military are going to be arrested on return to their home countries. It just feels a bit like the whole house of cards is collapsing. So that's the crisis of Zionism. But then, because of that crisis, because Zionism is so incapable of defending itself, I think there's been an equal and opposite increase in repression in countries like Britain, where the British state, British employers have stepped in to try and massively suppress ordinary people like my client, Mark, from saying obvious stuff about Israel because it's doing so much damage that they have to be like, you cannot even say this stuff. So the crisis of Zionism is accompanied by a corresponding crisis of free speech, specifically around Palestine and anti-Zionism. And it seems to me that that these cases are now almost impossible to defend. Like, employers finding themselves with these kinds of court cases are just very, very likely to try and throw money at it to solve the problem, because if it goes to trial, it's going to be so bad for them. So there is a crisis, and I would say employment tribunal is one of the obvious places where that crisis plays out. But there was this interesting story that surfaced to do with Tottenham, and this is quite tricky legally, because the tricky part comes in trying to establish. So the story is that Tottenham Football Club, their social media account, I think it was their Twitter account, started blocking people who were criticising the club because the club had an Israeli player who was on loan. He came back, and then fans were roundly criticising him because of his politics and because of what he...
I think he was on loan at Celtic.
Oh, is that right?
I think so, yeah. Which links back to what we were saying about the sort of multitudinous nature of football clubs as institutions and organisations.
Yeah, that's a mood. I can't imagine it would be too fun for a Zionist Israeli guy at Celtic. But I just think if you can show... What would be necessary for the Equality Act is to show that there's a relationship on which the Equality Act bites. And employment, that's obvious. If you're employed by someone, they're not allowed to discriminate against you. Question whether you can show the requisite relationship between a Twitter account and a fan. But I think there's a case to be made. I would need to look into it if anyone wants to have this in a more formal way with me. I'm very happy to have a discussion about it. You need to show that the relationship was somehow governed by the Equality Act, and you might be able to do it if there was a season ticket holder who was blocked in that way. You could attempt to argue that it was part of their contractual relationship with the club as a season ticket holder, that they would be allowed to express their opinions on social media about it and not expect to be blocked by it. It's my understanding that Tottenham rode back on that decision and they said, oh, we shouldn't have done that. But just as a matter, again, of the Equality Act, if there is a relationship that bites, it's pretty clear to me that it's discriminatory. They're singling out, so it's direct discrimination. Section 13 of the Equality Act says don't discriminate against someone because of their protected characteristics. It seems obvious. There's no real basis for doubting that they were singling out anti-Zionists. If you're an anti-Zionist and you manifest that belief, we're going to block you. But also there's this indirect discrimination argument, which is, the obvious example of indirect discrimination is you must be this tall to be a police officer or whatever. So they're not saying no women, but they're indirectly discriminating against women. And if what you do is you say, we're going to block people who criticize the apartheid state of Israel, it's likely to be the case that Palestinians are going to be caught up in that dragnet more than others. And it's likely to be the case that Muslims are going to get caught up in that dragnet more than others, in particular because of the way that Zionism is such an Islamophobic ideology and it consistently attacks, in particular, Al-Aqsa Mosque. So interesting to see if that legal case could get off the ground. But if it does, if you can show the contractual relationship, it seems pretty clear from where I'm standing that that yet again we've got a Premier League club systematically suppressing anti-Zionist speech.
So if you are, like me, somebody who's done a bit of casework as a shop steward, then this might be one for you to put that hat on, but in your sort of capacity as a football fan, have a go. What would you say to football fans who might ask what this has got to do with football and why they should care?
Well, I would say, I'll leave you to have the last word, Tasnima. I would say that your club will be what you make of it. And currently, it's like I've said, there's a spectrum. There's some clubs that have done very well around this stuff. Green Brigade's been good. Like I said, the Dublin Bohemians have been good.
As you say, that the Green Brigades are supporters as opposed to a part of the sort of business or organisation of Celtic Football Club.
Exactly. So I think that's the thing is to to try and think about what it would mean for fans to regain control over the clubs, which in many cases it's absolutely clear they have lost control to a great extent, but all is not lost. You can always, pluck up your courage and try and think about what it means to develop an organizing strategy. And ultimately, like I sort of say this to a lot of my clients, and I don't want to be too rhetorical or whatever, but it really is a question about, how do you want to live? Like, do you want to be the kind of person who just watches the beautiful game and ignores the fact that a genocide is happening, and ignores the way these things are always linked in different ways, and just kind of nods along and goes, all right, I'm not gonna bother myself too much about this? Or are you going to try and fight back, and like fight back against your clubs who are stopping you from waving Palestine flags, stopping you from expressing solidarity, firing loyal staff members of your clubs because they dared to express the correct position on their public social media that was in no way even affiliated to the club? Like, are we going to live in a world where if you criticize an apartheid state while it commits a genocide, that you just get met with these obnoxious consequences? I just don't like being pushed around, and I think my client Mark Bonnick doesn't like being pushed around. I just don't think you should let people push you around, whether that's your club or whether that's some Zionist with a gun or a cop or whoever it might be. Just don't let anyone push you around. And what's currently happening is these big Premier League clubs are pushing you around. They're pushing around their staff. They're pushing around their players. They're pushing around their fans and saying, don't do this. You open your mouth about Palestine and there's going to be trouble. I just don't like being spoken to that way. I don't like being treated that way. And I think most fans are probably the same. There is a solution to it, but we're going to have to find that solution together. I hope that this case can be a marginal part of that solution. Just be like, here's a working class lad with his head screwed on, right, and said entirely correct things about Israel, and he's taken the decision to stick his head above the parapet, go public with his case and say, don't push me around, you better give me my job back.
I remember David Goldblatt appearing on a sort of a very early iteration, the great sort of football sociologist David Goldblatt, appearing on an early iteration of this project and saying that football actually contains massive potential for civil disobedience on quite a grand scale. Is that kind of what you're driving at?
Absolutely. And again, to sort of end where we started, we were talking about my relationship to football and stuff. I mean, I do love football. I played football as a kid. I played lots of sports, Gaelic football and football. And I've got a very good friend who lives up in Ipswich, and he's a Town fan. And I've been to a few Ipswich Town games. I've been to an Arsenal game back in the day. I've been to many, many football games, as well as Gaelic football games, all the rest of it. And it's beautiful. I love football. I'm obsessed with it. Like I don't currently have a team, but I've always loved the game. Like I remember watching.
You're interviewing for the
mate. Like I'm not. No, I wrote a controversial article that a lot of my Irish Republican friends still haven't forgiven me for, where I said anyone but England, because back in the day, Irish people would say, we will support anyone but England. There's no way we're supporting the England team. And I spent enough time in London, and I seen that final with the Euros, Italy and England, and I was in a working class pub in Deptford, and I was like, this is beautiful. This is not people who are in favour of the colonial occupation of Ireland. This is working class Londoners who are like looking at a load of working class black kids who've done good or whatever. Marcus Rashford is leader of the opposition. I was like, there's something going on here that's being dismissed when you say anyone but England. So I wrote this article saying my rough and ready take on that game. It was in Novara Media. Oh, it wasn't. Sorry, it wasn't. The take on that wasn't my take on the Euros. It was my take on England crashing out of the World Cup against Croatia. And I was in a very different, more middle class pub in Hackney for that. And then and I was sort of reflecting on, what does this mean?
That was the Wally with the brolly, wasn't it?
Right. So I think football is an amazing game. Like, I've been at Ipswich games where I'm like, this is religious. Like, and I'm not trying to be blasphemous or whatever, but it's like it's a religious experience. Like, to be among that many working class people screaming, to all be focusing on the same thing. I remember watching the World Cup final with my mum in France, in a very Arab neighborhood in France where my mum lives. And, the way that Moroccan team sort of made it through it was Morocco, wasn't it? Or was it Algeria? Yeah. It was the Moroccan team, wasn't it? It did really well. And then watching the final with her, like, it's religious. Like it's amazing. Like, billions of people watching the same game. It's an incredible thing, and it's liminal and it's indeterminate, and we can determine it in a way that's anti-Zionist. We can determine it in a way that looks like the kind of world that we want to live in. It's just that, like, we have to organize. Like, these are our spaces. These are really vital, beautiful communal spaces, and we should regain control of them so that we can stand in solidarity with Palestinians who have as much right as anyone to participate in the beautiful game.
Football is politics, and politics is football. There's no separation.
This is very much our jam on this podcast.
There's no separation. And, what Franck was saying is that, as a football fan, as someone watching football, we fundamentally believe in everyone's right to just play football. Be it kids, be it women, be it men, and that is being systematically crushed and destroyed by Israel. There is no other member state in FIFA where one member state is getting away from, killing more than 500 Palestinian athletes and footballers. Now they're being systematically targeted. And as a football fan, that is completely, so away from the game. And, we saw, and also if we just look at football and see, I think Ilan Pappy said it as well, about how integral football is to Zionism as well, and how much they've used it. Specifically, the fact that, there is a reason why FIFA has been suspending Israel for so long. And that's because of, Israel really, doing what they do best and going behind the scenes and forcing, and pressuring, using their diplomatic and powers to force or to stop them from doing this. But the fact that Israel is using this so much is, I think, to football fans, is a chance for us to understand how we need to take it back, basically. Football is the working person's game. It always has been. And across the world, football is that one sport that does unify every single and can unify every single person. And if we're looking at where the masses are, they are watching football. They're at the football games. These are even the ultras, even that are not organising for Palestine. They're still organising. And I think football fans need to ask themselves the question, how safe and how much they're willing to give up, just because, again, of a state committing genocide. And I've also seen loads of supporters clubs, even some Muslim supporters clubs, that have been shying away from the subject because they know when they start talking about it, their access to the club and their access, to having supporters club is going to go. And I just want them to question, how fragile their position must be, and how fragile all our positions must be if all we have to do is talk against a state committing genocide that we've all seen. That's when you lose your position at your club. How fragile is your position then, and how representative are you then? And this goes to Muslim supporters group and also South Asian supporters groups that I've seen, again, shying away from this issue. Is central to us, and that's why Gaza is central to all of us, and not just in football but everywhere. It really is that mirror to a world, to a better world, but also a world where this is what happens if we don't do anything. This is Gaza now, and it's the rest of the world after.
What do we want our clubs to mean?
Yeah.
There's all this meaning bound up with our clubs. What do we want our clubs to mean? What do we want our game to mean? With Gary Lineker's situation, do we see that as something that's scary? Do we see that as something that's potentially quite encouraging, the thin end of kind of a good wedge? Or is it a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both. I think you can understand why people are scared to talk out if they're seeing someone as big as Gary Lineker even being disciplined. But I think there's a very easy way to solve that, and it's just more people speaking out. Because they can't fire everyone, and they can't take away every fan's membership, and they can't, there's only a small number of stewards compared to how many even fans there are in the game. They can't stop everyone. And I think there's a really easy way to really get out of that. And it's just the more people you speak. And it is encouraging as well, though.
Yeah, it does demonstrate the limits of sort of individuals taking action in an individuated way, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's tricky. I broadly think it's very hopeful what he's done, and he deserves credit for the way that he's conducted himself.
Yeah, he's shown some courage.
And I think that there's a spectrum of workplaces, because I'm wary about saying, oh, you should be scared to do what Gary did because he got fired. If he could get fired, so could you. I don't think that's quite right. There's a spectrum of workplaces. Some workplaces are very, very supportive of this stuff, right? And then there's workplaces like Arsenal that have behaved atrociously and need to apologise to my client and give him his job back, right? so there's a whole so there's one axis there, which
Can you
is
tell he's a lawyer?
one end of the spectrum is good workplaces that broadly let you be anti-Zionist because that's the correct position, and then there's the bad workplaces. But then there's also people's relative power within their workplaces. And my read on the Lineker situation is that he was like too big to fail. He was beloved, multiple capped for England. He was an England captain, was he, at one point?
He was, I think, England captain for a while. He was very nearly leading goal scorer for England ever, but he missed a penalty against Brazil and didn't equal the record.
Exactly.
Famously, was never given a yellow card.
Right. So
sort
really,
of national teddy bear.
exactly.
He is, yeah.
Everyone loves him, and then he went on to present Match of the Day for, was it 2 decades or something? Just
Something
like
ridiculous.
absolutely too big to fail.
Yeah.
He knew no one can touch me.
Yeah, I mean, I've always had a bit of a sort of like a slight issue with Gary Lineker in that he did get paid so much money for hosting a programme that people would still watch if it was hosted by my 8-year-old.
Yeah.
Because it's the national obsession with all the shit bits edited out.
Yeah.
But, welcome to the revolution, Gary.
Exactly. And then it's almost like to put him in company with people who are like slightly less flattering. It's kind of like Jeremy Clarkson, Piers Morgan type people, right? Jeremy Clarkson, I think he was accused of assaulting someone, wasn't he? There was some...
Yeah, and he said it was racist as well.
He's done a few racisms, yeah.
Yeah. So he's like, but I'm Jeremy Clarkson, so I can just watch. So he got kicked off of Top Gear, whatever it was, and walked into another show. And then you've got Piers Morgan, who had that hilarious storming off midair thing. And it was obviously just confected drama because he was going to set up Piers Morgan Uncensored. So I think in some ways, Gary Lineker was just a bit like, well, I can't really lose. I may as well double down because maybe he has a conscience, but also like he's just like too big to fail.
Older guy as well, sort of probably closer to the end of his career than the beginning.
Exactly. And so the question becomes, well, what if you're not Gary Lineker? What can you do about it? And the only thing I would say, I suppose a couple of things I would say is, number one, like, the correct position is the correct position. And I'll come back to, are you going to let people push you around? Like, are you going to let your boss push you around just because you're not Gary Lineker? Like, no, you should fight back, get the trade union involved, obviously, if you find yourself in this kind of situation. The way to deal with it is to collectivize it, to be like, well, I'm just one person, but the Palestinian struggle is a collective struggle, but also the struggle within this workplace is a collective struggle. Get your union involved. Get a team of people around you so that you can respond to it in a collective way. And the second thing I would say is that getting paid lots of money is better than a kick in the teeth. Like, if you sue your if you sue your employer and you win, you get paid a lot of money. And like a lot of my cases are behind NDAs, right? Non-disclosure agreements, which means I can't talk about specific cases. But there's so many of them. There's so many of these anti-Zionist clients that I've represented that I can talk in general terms about the kind of settlements that we're seeing. And people getting paid sometimes tens of thousands of pounds, even in circumstances where they've walked into another job. So there's no real consequential losses we talk about, right? There's no loss of earnings because you fired me and then I was unemployed for 6 months. It's like cases involving people walking into other jobs where employers are throwing money at them to be quiet because they know that if they don't get a non-disclosure agreement, that they will go to the press and they'll probably get paid a bunch of money. So it's like, look, I think it's like I said, Zionism cannot defend itself anymore. It can't defend itself generally politically, but certainly if you go into court and you have 4, 5, 6 days of an employment tribunal hearing to really lay into the way that your managers treated you, and there are stupid explanations, right, saying, oh, well, this was very, very controversial, and then you just put their own statements to them, like, hold on, so Black Lives Matter, is that very, very controversial? And then all this stuff about, well, a Zionist called up, a member of the public called up and said they didn't like that my employee, my worker, had said that Palestinian lives matter, and then just inviting them to think, okay, so with Black Lives Matter, if a white supremacist calls up your workplace and says, I'm not very happy that your employee said Black Lives Matter, would you listen to that person? No, you'd say, oh, I'm sorry that you're so racist. We don't care what you think. The guy keeps his job, like, jog on. Like, that's how you would respond if my client had said Black Lives Matter, but because they said Palestine lives matter, you fired them. What's the difference? And you just hammer them. There's no defense. There is no defense. And the only defense is anti-Palestinian racism. And even in the courts of England and Wales, that doesn't really fly. So, like, get organised and fight back, because it's not nice to be pushed around, and you should be allowed to express solidarity with Palestinians if you want to. But also, when you sue people and win, they pay you money. It's like, it's not bad.
For those of you watching this and wondering, yes, he is like this more or less all the time. We were going to talk a bit about Guardiola as well. There's footage came to light recently of Pep Guardiola making some minimally pro-Palestinian right-on remarks. What should we make of that?
I think it was very obvious that he was talking about Gaza. I mean, he obviously mentioned Gaza, but I think Pep Guardiola, obviously his daughter is very on it when it comes to Palestine.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of evidence for those who don't know, or in instances on social media of Pep Guardiola's daughter being really quite active on this issue in particular, isn't there?
And I think I do remember Pep Guardiola like referencing it briefly maybe a year or two ago in a press conference when people were asking him about stuff, and he said, why does it matter? There are people being bombed, there are kids being bombed, what, go over there, report on what actually matters. And I think that was very obviously in reference to Gaza. I think footballers, I've heard that there have been quite a few instances of footballers being speaking out about Palestine and then getting either disciplined or something. But it really takes, when it comes to players especially, like the power that they have, it's actually crazy. And it takes literally a few of them to just stand in support with Palestine for, shit to actually like break, basically, I think, because like, again, the power footballers especially hold is...
It's almost unlike any other profession, isn't it? I mean, we've talked a lot about the need for solidarity and collectivism. As a footballer, you don't really, you don't bargain collectively. You bargain as an individual. And if you're good, and if you've got the right agent, you do so very, very successfully and end up being very well remunerated, which gives you enormous power, as you're saying, Tasnima. It's, it really wouldn't take much, I wouldn't have thought. I have to say, I can't quite see what they're so scared of.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we see cases of obviously like Anwar Ghazi, and I hope he doesn't listen to this podcast because honestly, I think he became a name after really he started speaking out on Palestine because he's quite a mid player.
He was on the way down, was he? I think he was at Villa and played in the Premier League at Villa, but when Villa was still losing to the likes of my team, Southampton, rather than being in the Champions League.
Someone like, you're going to go, but he's quite a known, I think, name now. People know because. And it was specifically because he decided to speak out against how he was treated by Mainz, his team at the club in Germany. And I think usually players wouldn't also talk about the repression that they're facing. But once you're actually open about it, and I think that's really the way you have to be about any sort of censorship and repression. You have to, you can't double down. You have to keep going and showing what is going on. And that's why he got such a big settlement. I think it was $1 million or something, and he donated like half of that to Palestine as well, and then he moved to an English football club. Welsh.
Yeah.
I think that's what we need in England. I think we need an example of that in England because Germany's so crazy on this stuff. Like they're so.
Our last guest, Musa Okwonga, lives in Berlin and strongly implied certain things about what it was like to kind of speak out on this issue.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like the Germans are insanely narcissistic about this. Like everything's about how guilty they feel about the Holocaust committed by Nazis against Jews, and so they're now just sort of openly apologizing for another genocide. It's like, lads, can you just step away from the genocide? And also, who asked you? Like, do you know what I mean? I do think a footballer in the English Premier League, in principle, would be able to rely on the Equality Act, and I think that's explosive legally, right? Like, and that's not to detract from Mark Bonnick's case. Like, Mark Bonnick is alleged in some ways he's leading the charge, but for a footballer to do that, like, that would be massive. For a footballer to even just take to Twitter and say something, and then to experience a detriment for having done that from their club, like the club's in really serious difficulty if they do that.
But right now we can like count the number of football players in England who have said anything. Yeah, Sam Morsy, obviously Hamza Chowdhury, but he had to apologise after his thing. But like, again,
What's your man McLean saying? Because he always gets into trouble for the poppy stuff, right? He's like,
James McLean.
He's from Derry, isn't he?
Pardon?
Is he from Derry or Belfast or somewhere? He's from the north of Ireland and he's a Catholic. And he's like, I'm not wearing a poppy, mate. And they're all like,
I'm not sure
he gets death threats
where
and
he's
stuff.
from. He is, I mean, he's a sort of like Republican Irish guy. I think he's at Wrexham now, who of course are the kind of like...
Someone needs to WhatsApp him and say, mate, you need to branch out and say something about Palestine.
Yeah, no.
Mark has actually got also like support from previous players, like because they still have their number and all that stuff. So he's actually got support from previous players as well. But again, it hasn't been.
Probably wouldn't be all that difficult to guess who they might be. Yeah. To be honest. Yeah, we probably can't do that, can we? But it might be more of a fun parlour game than something to be discussed on something that is hopefully going to be shared far and wide. Thanks very much to Tasnima and Frank. Thank you to you for watching this. As I said earlier, we went down the route of video content for this because we felt that it was too vital a conversation to not really, in football parlance, give it the full bollocks and try and get as much traction for it as we possibly can. So as such, we're going to ask you to, as well as go into our Pro Revolution Soccer Patreon account and chuck in us some money, please share this far and wide. Share it with people who you think probably have like solid politics, solid position on this, but might be a little bit meek and mild about saying so because of the way pro-Palestinian voices get treated in this country and in this polity. Share it potentially with people who might very strongly disagree with it because of, the dialectics, baby, but also because it might wind them up. All the wrong people cheering or all the right people booing can sometimes be a good generative thing. Send it to football lads and lasses who might be sort of unaware of how the beautiful game gets used to suppress people who are trying to speak out on things. Anyway, all that remains is for me to bid you adieu, to remind you that trans women are women, to remind you that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, and to say goodbye and good night, lads.